So welcome everybody to the third webinar of the International Geraniaceae Group. I'm really pleased that we're joined by a very knowledgeable field guide, Frank Gaude, who is originally from Germany, but has worked from Cape Town for the past several decades and is an accredited field guide, tour guide in South Africa. He originally worked in Cape Town as a student and then returned to Germany and then again returned back to Cape Town, being drawn to the fynbos and to the nature around Cape Town. He studied social anthropology, which has very little to do with today's subject. But I've had the pleasure of interacting with Frank on various topics related to vegetation, to pelargoniums and other flowers in the Cape Flora region. And I'm absolutely delighted that he's joined us today. Over to you, Frank.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Mattia. Thank you for the kind introduction. I hope you will enjoy the talk that I'm giving on Zoom. This is my premiere, but so I hope the glitch from earlier on won't repeat itself. But I want to give a general introduction to the fynbos biome. We have 9 biomes in South Africa, and the fynbos biome is the one where I live and that I'm most exposed to, even though I do travel throughout the country. Both on tours with clients, but also privately. I can't stop it. It's just too exciting to live in South Africa. And the social anthropology doesn't come handy anymore, but somehow social anthropology is a little bit of everything. So maybe, who knows? Not for the purpose of today's talk. Okay. So so we have let me just go to the next slide, which shows a map of South Africa. It's a relief map, so it shows elevation, and it's maybe an attempt to explain the general climate of South Africa. We do, the climate is determined by elevation and by water currents. We have the warm Agulhas current coming from the equator along the east coast of the country, and on the west coast we have the cold Benguela current, the Atlantic Ocean. And so a lot more evaporation is happening on the east coast. It is much warmer there and continuously throughout the year, allowing lots of precipitation to happen, so a lot more rainfall than on the Atlantic side. And we have in the central area of the country is a plateau. So everything is fairly high, starting from the Cape Fold Mountains here. If I go further up, there would be the Drakensberg, and that goes all the way up to Mpumalanga and the northernmost province, which name I'm not getting at. And so those areas are then kept relatively dry because it's fenced off practically by those mountain ranges, which then results in the formation, or resulted in the formation, of those areas which we have classified, which have been classified as the 9 biomes of South Africa. So if I start from the east, just give a sentence or two to every biome. In the east, we have the Indian Ocean coastal belt, an area that receives a lot of rain, fairly constantly, high temperatures. It basically resembles, one could say it resembles the tropics in climate and vegetation. It's also referred to as the tropical inclusion zone because it does harbor many tropical species, even though it is not in tropical latitude, which only starts at the Tropic of Capricorn up in the north of the country. Joining the Indian Ocean coastal belt is the largest of the biomes, the savanna biome. Savanna biome is quite readily identifiable by two layers of vegetation, the grass layer and the tree layer. And yeah, this is all harboring most of the remaining large herds of animals in the country. There have been animals in most parts of the country. Often they have been extinct, but also most areas are not as fertile and offer as many grazing grounds as the savannas. Apart from, well, there are the grasslands, which is the next biome here, fairly central on elevated height. The grasslands biome obviously dominated by grass layer. That doesn't mean it's only grass. There are lots of orchids in there, lots of pelargoniums, beautiful flowers. Includes also the alpine vegetation of the Drakensberg, which is here around Lesotho. Lesotho seems to have been annexed on this map. Yeah, then to the south we have the thicket biome, close to Port Elizabeth, East London. This area does not have particularly defined strata of vegetation. You find everything from grass level to tree height, and it all ideally, originally interweaves into impenetrable vegetation with a high content of succulents, like euphorbias and aloes, and which makes it not as fire prone as many others of the biomes. To the northwest of the thicket biome, we have the Namakuru. Namakuru is a semi-desert area, and this semi-desert area receives mainly rainfall in summer, contrary to its neighbor, the succulent Karoo. The succulent Karoo is a winter rainfall semi-desert and is a lot richer in biodiversity than the Namakuru. To the north of those two, we have a little bit of desert bordering Namibia, and desert would be characterized by less than 80 millimeters of rain per year, and mainly annuals would survive in those conditions. And then we have a little bit of forest. Forest is the smallest of the biomes. There's a little bit of forest on what is known as the garden route, starting, I would say, between George and Tsitsikamma. You do get Afro-montane forest, or Afro-temperate rainforest, and then you get little pockets of forest all over in KZN, on the escarpment, in Mpumalanga, and also in Cape Town we have little pockets of forest. So and otherwise it's all dominated by the fynbos biome. The fynbos biome being the one that we look at in detail. Right, so what's fynbos? The main characteristics of fynbos. Fynbos is a Mediterranean, is dominated by Mediterranean climate, meaning mild, warm, dry summers and cool, wet winters in general. So it doesn't really get to freezing temperatures, at least not in the coastal areas of the fynbos biome, and it also doesn't reach very high temperatures. It's a fairly moderate climate. It looks more or less like Mediterranean, like other vegetation types with similar climate, like in the Mediterranean itself, or in California, everywhere where you have winter rainfall climate. It looks initially fairly similar, but there are some differences. So it's largely treeless. We do have some trees, but you will not find large pockets of forest, large areas of forest. So shrubby, mostly shrubland vegetation up to 3 meters. sometimes 4 meters, and it regularly burns. Fire is a feature of fine boss that is very important. It must happen, but it mustn't happen too often. So with human intervention, fire can either happen too frequently or not frequently enough. So for example, we say that fine boss should burn. The opinions are very different there, but some people say it should burn every 5 to 10 years. Others say every 10 to 20 years. Probably also depends on the type of fine boss. But yeah, when a fire happens too often, then only plants will survive which have a very quick reproductive cycle. And if it doesn't happen often enough, then the vegetation becomes senescent, so that it stops growing, stops flowering. Many species don't even bother to emerge after rains. So for example, some orchid and bulb species are fire dependent, and they will only show themselves after fires or in the first few years after fires. So what is very special about fine boss is its biodiversity. So we have more or less 9,000 plant species in the fine boss biome, which is fairly high, and about, say, 70% of those species don't occur anywhere else than in this area. So how come that it's so diverse? You see the area here, that would be the fine boss biome, and it's basically fenced off to the central part of the country by mountain ranges, by the Cape Fold Mountains, which start in the west, in the northwest with Cederberg and Matsikama Mountains, and ends with the Tsitsikama Mountains in the east, before Port Elizabeth. And yeah, so we have lots of varying soil types, lots of varying microclimates. There are different rocks which create different pH levels in the soil. So all those factors contribute to the biodiversity, which has also been able to develop and become quite pronounced over time, because it has, all those factors have been there fairly stable over a prolonged period of time. So the climate in its variability, in its yeah, again, my apologies. So the 3 main categories or main vegetation types we have in fine boss are fine boss proper, so to speak, and then the Strandveld and the Renosterveld. The other ones that are here are not that well represented that it's worth going into, but fine boss, Strandveld and Renosterveld, at least here in the Cape area, are very present. So fine boss is grows on acidic, nutrient-poor soils. This picture here is from the George area, from the Outeniqua Mountains, part of the Cape Fold Mountains. This was before a fire, which hadn't burned for quite a while. So you do see some higher plants, lots of ericas in the front. This is a daisy, one of the Asteraceae, a suncarpa. So it hadn't burned here in a while, but in the meantime it has burned and it looks very different. The fine boss is dominated by the 3 main groups, would be the Proteus, Restios, and Ericas. There's the Proteus and the Restios, those 3 groups, 3 families. There are lots of other plants that are very dominant, such as orchids, many bulbous plants, succulents, the Asteraceae. I'm not going to go into the Asteraceae at all here, because don't have a good grip on them. It's a huge family with many genera, but not very fascinating, of course. And they don't just look like daisies like one commonly imagines them to look with the radial flowers. Also those syncarpers are quite interesting. So part of fynbos are fires. Fynbos, as mentioned, is inextricably linked to fires. This is a very recent fire around Devil's Peak. It burned a couple of weeks ago. It was quite a disaster, but not for nature. It hadn't burned there in a while and was due to happen. But unfortunately, the archives of UCT, the University of Cape Town, have burned, and large parts were lost there. Lots could be recovered, but that was unfortunate. But it's normal in terms of a natural cycle that it has to burn, and people have to adapt to it. Nature recovers very quickly from fires. And some plants respond very positively and immediately flower after fire, like this amaryllit, which is a crocine guttata. They're not entirely fire dependent. They can flower without being exposed to fires, but they certainly flower more prolifically than without fires, and also are more conspicuous in the barren landscape. Right, so I'm missing a logo. As said, the three main groups to identify fynbos are the proteas, the ericas, and the restios. And then the many other groups I'm going to look, apart from the proteas and the restios and the ericas. I'm not so much looking at restios, at the irises, the pelargoniums, I would have to, and but also not too much. I think in a group of specialists, I should keep a low profile with the pelargoniums. And yeah, and orchids. Orchids is one of my passions. Orchids, and I also like other bulbs. I'm a bulb person, I think. And if you can include orchids and bulbs, then that's me in a nutshell. So amaryllis is also lovely. Lots of Amaryllidaceae. Right, so starting with proteas, this is the king protea in its habitat in the Kocheberg Mountains. This is, I think, 1 or 2 years, 2 years after fire. They don't die from fires, the rootstocks survive, and you have here the new shoots with the flowers and also the old parts of the protea with the old seed capsules. The seed capsules of proteas, as far as I know, all of them remain closed until exposed to a fire. So they will not release their seed unless there has been a fire. Makes a lot of sense, because if there is a solid vegetation cover, there will not be much space for new plants. So once there's everything has been cleared by the fire, then the struggle begins. Who's going to colonize the bare soil first? And those have an advantage who respond to fire. And fynbos, probably all plants in some way or another. The king protea is one of those that seed after fire, but it also resprouts from its rootstock. Some proteas are killed by fires. The king protea resprouts. It's a resprouter. So as it says here, more or less 400 species in fynbos of the proteas and 14 genera. They're not only proteas in South Africa, and they're not only proteas in Africa. They're actually a lot of proteas, I think more than in South Africa and Australia. And some of them have come to South Africa and have spread quite rapidly, like the Hecklias. They're not very popular in the Cape for that reason. So here are some examples of different genera. This is from the sugar bushes protea. The Protea magnifica is one of the largest flower heads. It's procumbent, so it's on the ground. I think it gets pollinated by rodents. It's quite interesting. And there's leucodendrons, the cone bushes. This is a species from the Cedarburg, Aquatum. Leucospermum, maybe not the best example, but the nicest I found now, Leucospermum lineare. They are, the pincushions are quite spectacular. They're very popular as cut flowers. Then I like mamitis a lot. Mamitis they're also referred to as pagodas because their flowers appear stacked, similar to those Asian temples. And then there are quite a few more. The Paranomus reflexus, Cerurius, the blushing brides or spinacop, which means spider flowers. There's another Ceruria villosa. Here's another pincushion. There will be more pincushions coming up later, but for now, that's what we have. And yeah, Spatula, I didn't know until recently. I wasn't aware of this genus until I came across it in the Langeberg in the Swellendam area. And yeah, they're certainly quite interesting looking. The Protea flower heads, they always consist of multiple flowers, many flowers, and those are not petals, those are bracts. So colorful leaves, basically. Next group, the Ericas. The family of Ericas there's more or less one genus. I think it is one genus only, which are the Ericas. In South Africa, we have around 800 species, and most of them are in the fine-boss biome. So they will be also somehow adapted to fire. Many have tubular flowers like these, and this is the Baphomanus and the Overberg, and many are also visited by sugarbirds that pollinate those, the ones with the tubular flowers. So there are more examples of Ericas with tubular flowers, fascicularis. This is a Cape dwarf chameleon clinging to it. I like chameleons. I'm afraid I'm a reptile person, so they do come up every now and then. Yeah, this is one of my passions, and this is quite nice. It's a Cape dwarf chameleon. They're a very common species, but this one is what they call the fine-boss morph. So they're slightly different to the lowland Cape dwarf chameleon, and they are a bit more seldom seen than the common one. The common one is probably prettier at first sight, but this is more special. So, yeah, the others, Erica densifolia and discolor, they're from the Outeniqua Mountains, Vestita and Monsoniana from the Revier Sonder End Mountains, which is just northeast of Cape Town. Ericas are really beautiful, often dismissed as boring, but yeah, it's a matter of perspective. And if one as so often is the case, one has to zoom in and look a bit closer. Right, Iridaceae, that's probably the family with the most species and amongst bulb plants in South Africa. This is an example of Watsonia, which Watsonia was it? I think Watsonia marginata on Lion's Head. Lion's Head is one of the central mountains on the peninsula that gets climbed a lot, and it's probably the mountain that gets the most climbed in the entire world. It's a very popular mountain, unfortunately, because of this overuse of the mountain. The area burns all the time, which is bad for some plants. The Watsonias love it. So they respond very well to fires. But you will see, one can see that there's a high content already of annual plants on Lion's Head, and not much higher vegetation than knee height. It's a pity, but for floral displays like these, this is always quite a safe area in the October, November time of year. So nice genera of the Iridaceae would be Gladioli and Morea. Find a lot of those all over the shows. So what is the ones that are quite that do stick out are probably the red ones. The red ones do get pollinated by a butterfly that is specialized in red plants. I'll get to that later. But yeah, so all those gladioli I'm not quite sure how many species we have in South Africa, but it doesn't, I think it's about 170. There's going to be a new book published in August, I believe, on gladioli by the Saunders. The Saunders have not survived to publish this book. They died, unfortunately, or they died before the book was finished, but it's now going to be published on their behalf. It's very exciting that it still comes into being. Yeah, Moreas are just as exciting. Moreas, also genus of the Iridaceae iris family. The Morea ciliata is a very variable species that occurs here from Cape Town. That's the furthest south I've seen it, but I've also seen it very far north in Namaqualand. And it then looks quite different, especially the leaves adapt to circumstances. Morea ochroloica, which is a bit overrepresented here on this, is quite variable. Response to fire I think those were all seen after fire in Silvermine Nature Reserve, and the variety with the orange center on yellow petals, that's the normal one. One also gets those deep orange ones. That's rather exceptional, and they do get visited by those monkey beetles. That's I suppose those are the pollinators. I don't know if they're so specialized that they only get pollinated by one species, but monkey beetles are quite conspicuous. Right, moving on to the orchids. Orchids, we have about 450 species in South Africa, about half of them in the fynbos biome. This is a habitat shot of Dicer uniflora, which is probably the most famous of South African orchids. They used to be very popular worldwide and also harvested here in nature and exported to, I think, mainly Britain and the Netherlands, and from there, wherever they were in demand. I wonder how successful, because they're not very easy to look after. But there are still widespread from, I would say, Cape Town in the south to Cedarburg in the north and Greyton in the east. So it's quite a widespread species, but very special with that deep red color. So we have many of the orchid genera are monotypical, so there are quite a few which only have one species in the genus. The Dicers have let's see, 144 species, 88 here in the area, in the fynbos. It's just a selection of the ones that I have recently come across. The Dicer uniflora, of course, who lives in Cape Town will see those on a regular basis, well, for those who like walking. And yeah, quite striking, the long lip of Dicer multifida. It's not quite known why it has this lip. It's also not known who pollinates this plant, because all the orchids are very particular who pollinates them, and all the orchids have some method of deceit to attract a pollinator, mostly without any reward for the pollinator, but only for the orchid. So some of them imitate wasps, like here, the Disa bivalvata will attract wasps who think they can mate with something that looks like those flowers, but in the process they will pollinate the plant or take the pollinia with them and bring them to the next flower. So the orchids, same with Dicer uniflora, it gets pollinated by the Table Mountain beauty butterfly, which is attracted by red flowering plants. It's quite rare in the insect world that red gets recognized, but this butterfly goes for red flowering plants. Also Dicer uniflora, where it will not be rewarded with anything, with any nectar, but it will pass the pollinia from one flower to the next. So maybe briefly where they occur, this is on the Swartberg Pass, Dicer coalescens, also in the mountains, most of those plants are in the mountain, are mountainous. Yeah, Dicer venusta, not so much, can also be at sea level. And yeah, that is about that for the Dicers. These are a few orchids, Cape orchids that are non-dicer. Disperis, we don't have too many species, but the one that is always, that should start soon in July, is Disperis capensis, also known as Mudakapi, because it looks a little bit or witch's hood or something like that. It looks a bit like a hooded figure. If one wants to look at it that way, this could be the hood. The spider orchid, the acrolothias, quite interesting plants. The particularly rare one is Acrolothia lunata. I was happy to see that in the Outeniqua Mountains in George. Acrolothia capensis, it says this is not correct. Sorry, this is Acrolothia lamellata. And it looks very similar to Acrolothia bolusii, except Acrolothia bolusii looks like it's been turned upside down. See that? The lip is actually turned upside down. And all of those, one is not quite sure what pollinates it. Maybe they're self-pollinating, maybe wind-pollinated. One does see lots of insects on them. Whether there is a particular insect that is the sole pollinator, I am not sure. In literature, one cannot find out much about it. So some of those orchids are fire dependent, like Pakitis. Pakitis one will only see after fires, maybe 1 or 2 seasons after a fire. After that, they go dormant and then will not be seen again until the next fire comes around. So they're quite staggered in a way. Some of the orchids will only flower several years after a fire, others immediately after a fire. Kerichandras, very beautiful orchids. This is a natural hybrid between those two, between grandiflora and globosa. And, so I'll move on to the next family, or in this case, genus. It's a not quite random selection of 6 Pelargonium species, and not in any particular order or why I chose them, but let's start in the middle. Pelargonium cuculatum is certainly the most dominant Pelargonium in the area of Cape Town on the peninsula. On Table Mountain at Cape Point, always after fires, this is a pioneer that will colonize the burnt areas very quickly, and sometimes it's a sea of Pelargonium cuculatum that you can walk or drive through. Very beautiful, I find. But I always like, for me, it's always pretty over rare, so I believe that's not very sought after, the Pelargonium cuculatum, because it's such a commonplace species. But yet, this was a particularly interesting morph. It's usually they're solidly pink. And Pelargonium divisifolium I saw in Grayton 1 year after fire. I don't know whether it's a fire-dependent species. It's what was it called? It's a division that I'm not familiar with. Let me just see. I had it somewhere. Jenkinsonia. I didn't know those. I didn't know those before I looked it up. And Pelargonium triste, I think a very beautiful Pelargonium that grows from an enormous tuber in the ground. It's very widespread, very common, and I think never failed to disappoint, and never disappoints. It's very fragrant at night and is believed to be pollinated by moths and night flying insects. And Pelargonium ovale, apparently it's a very common species, very widespread. I only discovered my first ones last year on the Jonaskop in the Rivier Sonderend Mountains, which is just northeast of Cape Town, behind the winelands. And Pelargonium pinnatum I saw all over. That's section Horea, same as Rapaceum, they sprout from carrot-like leaves from almost carrot-like tuber, and they're obviously variable in flowers according to species. I found Pinnatum extremely variable. Must say, I always thought I had found a new species and was always being told on the Facebook group or on iNaturalist that yet another Pinnatum, which is interesting, but yeah. It's a pity sometimes if one hopes to have found something special, but there are specialists there in the variety. Right, then what is interesting about the Amaryllidaceae is that they mostly flower at times when there's not so much else in flower. And they are fairly spectacular. So there has been a recent publication, which is fantastic. Probably everybody's known it already. It's the Amaryllidaceae book. Oh, you can't see it like this now, but maybe, it's by Graham Duncan, Barajepi, and Lee Voigt. And actually don't know how to pronounce the name, but we'll spell it out, Voigt. Highly recommended, the Amaryllis family. And this is a Brunswickia orientalis. It's a widespread species. I usually associate them with sunfelds or close to the sea, sandy soils, where they're very visible because the surrounding vegetation is fairly low, and these umbels are about 40 to 50 centimeters across. So, and the color, as you can see, is quite luminous, especially in the mornings and evenings. So about 260, 270 taxa and 19 genera in South Africa. And most of the Western Cape species, fine boss species, are deciduous. Some examples, they can be quite variable within the family. These are Strumaria in the left corner, in the left top corner, Strumaria spiralis, flowering on Table Mountain after fire. I will go back this year and see if they flower. It has not grown much in the area in that 1 year after the fire, but I'm curious. I never took note of them before last year. Very pretty little, and maybe not typical amaryllids. Very commonplace Helminthes coccineus, one sees them a lot. That's maybe not the best picture because one should see the mottled stems. They're almost more beautiful than the flower itself. Then we have Brunswickia marginata. We have several Brunswickias here in the Cape. They're all stunning in their own right. Brunswickia marginata is a fairly small Brunswickia growing in the mountains behind Paarl in the Limitberg, or what is the other name? Right now I can only think of Hawequa Mountains, Limitberg or Hawequa Mountains. Amaryllis belladonna is known worldwide, I believe. It's the one of 2 amaryllis species of South Africa, and it's very widely grown in gardens as well. It's one plant that thrives on neglect in a Cape garden, so best you don't look after it, you will be rewarded with the best flowers. I don't know if it's like that elsewhere, whether it will be just as happy. Then Nerine sarniensis is, I think it's the opposite. Here in its habitat, it's very difficult to keep in the garden. Well, it will survive. Mine in the garden are thriving, they're growing very well, but they just don't like to flower. Conversely, they are grown with great success in England. Apparently very common garden plants in England and easy to grow. Then within the fine boss region, I would like to move on to some of the animals, the insects or the arthropods that are most important to plants, seemingly, of course, are the pollinators. I think the most important pollinators in fine boss are flies, beetles, and butterflies. I think this is the Table Mountain beauty butterfly that pollinates red flowering plants. Here it's a crassula, but it also pollinates the Dicer and Erica. gladiolus, everything that is red, and that mostly happens in December, January, February. In those months, one sees the butterflies and one sees those red flowering plants, a profusion of those. Then the flies, I'm not quite sure, this could be a tachinid fly, I'm not quite sure what it is, which one it is. It's on a Ferraria crispa. Ferraria is a species of iris, of the iris family, a genus of the iris family, and they often don't smell very good, but it attracts flies. Then this is a long-tongued fly on a Protea punctata in the Swartberg Mountains. The long-tongued flies are important for pelargonium lovers because they come in when it comes to the pollination of many species, I believe. Yeah, so those fruit chafers, they look a bit like bulldozers that run over the flowers. In this case, a brania, that's an acrolephia, an orchid, maybe it's just eating the orchid, I'm not too sure. Monkey beetles eat pollen and they often seem to overindulge. Monkey beetles, because of the long legs, often are head first in the center of the flower and seem to be eating the pollen and don't take note of anything else. Amphibians in the fynbos, we would have the endemic species would be some of the rain frogs. Rain frogs in general, breviate steppes occur up to East Africa, but here we have the Cape rain frog, which is about the size of a tennis ball, and the mountain rain frog, which is much smaller and you would find on Table Mountain, for example. They are more or less independent from water. They don't visit bodies of water. All their life happens outside in the ground, and not just in the ground, but largely in the ground. And they come out when it rains, and then they will also hear their call, hence their name, rain frog. Here, those two are in amplexus, which is very tricky when you're around like that. But they apparently glue themselves onto the back of the female during amplexus. The Western Cape leopard toad is a threatened species because most of the areas where it occurs are built on these days. Development is, of course, a big factor in the eradication of species. The Cape area, the Cape metropole is a big sprawl and it doesn't seem to stop. And it's going into spreads into several areas, the West Coast, into the Overberg, and to the detriment, of course, of many species, but the people have to go somewhere, I suppose. And another speciality from around here is the arum lily reed frog. The reed frogs are a huge genus of frog species all over Africa. The arum lily reed frog is the only one that is local, that is indigenous to the Cape, and is known as the arum lily reed frog because that's its favorite resting place, in the spathe of an arum lily. They're not necessarily there, you see them anywhere, but they seem to like those places. The spathes also attract a lot of insects. Maybe they find food there quite readily, quite possible. During the day, they sleep, as this one. Then moving on to the reptiles, we have the snakes, lizard, and tortoises. There are also there's also a species of terrapin, but snakes we have about, in South Africa, also 175 or so species. In the Cape, I think it's around 40. Out of those, it's only 3 that can be dangerous for people. The rest are either non-venomous or mildly venomous. Lizards, of course, again, a chameleon, they're the best. Then out of the tortoises, I think we only have 4 species here in the fynbos biome. The most common one is the angular tortoise. One sees that a lot. All right. Just quickly, the 3 dangerously venomous snakes of South Africa would be the boomslang, the puff adder, and the Cape cobra. None of those are interested in biting people, but they're very beautiful snakes, and it's always a joy to see them in nature. That was in Silvermine just after fire, so they seem to be able to survive fires quite well. Puff adders, also they rely on their camouflage and rarely bite people unless they get stepped on. And not even always then. I managed to step on one and didn't get bitten, not on purpose. And the Cape Cobra, yeah, when a Cape Cobra looks like that, then they're not happy. And when they spread the hood like that, it's a defensive position, right? Some more lizards that are typical for the area, the Cape Dwarf, the southern rock agama you see a lot, and the armadillo lizards, heavily poached species. They're very popular all over the world as a pet. Unfortunately, as are many of the others, actually, there's a lot of reptile poaching going on in South Africa. Fine-bossed birds, the Cape is a bit depauper when it comes to bird species. While birders might disagree, I'm not really a birder, I'll say that straight away, but they are undoubtedly beautiful, especially the orange-breasted sunbird is one of my favorites. They live primarily off the nectar of plants. Here it's on a king protea, the national flower of South Africa, and the Cape sugarbird is sitting on a pincushion. That was in Kirstenbosch. I think this is a selection of pincushion. I don't think it's a naturally occurring plant, naturally occurring plant. I think it's a hybrid, but seems to be producing nectar nonetheless. Some of the mammals, we don't have too many large mammal species left in the Cape. It is said that most of the large mammals that are still roaming the flats are still around here in the Cape. Used to be around in the Cape, but due to development, most of them are gone. But smaller ones, you still get the Cape mountain zebra. Successfully reintroduced on Table Mountain is the klipspringer, small antelope. Baboons are everywhere. In wild areas, I like baboons. I seem to be quite alone with that opinion, and they are unfortunately not that well liked by many people, and one tries to push them back or further the frontier, push the frontier further, and yeah, they're also, I hope they won't decline in numbers drastically. The dassies or rock hyraxes are supposed to be related to the elephants. Apparently they share common ancestors. It's not a very obvious relation. Right, sorry, I'm moving on to the next vegetation type, and those will be much shorter. Also in the case of Renosterfeld, because there's not so much left of it, unfortunately. Renosterfeld has fairly rich soils compared to Feinboss. Feinboss has very nutrient poor soils. This in Renosterfeld it's mostly quite rich, so it's snapped up by agriculture. It's also mostly flat in Renosterfeld. It's soil that is broken down mudstone and mostly mudstone and shale, so it's quite flat and easy to work with. There's not much of it left. I think 4% or something. There's less than 5% remaining. So it's a very, which is a pity because it's also the vegetation type that's used to support the large herds of animals. And many animal species, mammal species that used to roam the Renosterfeld disappeared together with most sections of Renosterfeld. So typical for Renosterfeld, you will see this gray nondescript bush shrub. This is called Renosterbos. Renoster meaning rhino, rhinoceros. And the Renosterbos is not a very attractive shrub, but it's quite easy. It's an Asteraceae, belongs to the Asteraceae. But what you do find in Renosterfeld is a multitude of highly specialized bulbous plants. So therefore it's highly exciting to go walking in Renosterfeld where there's a little bit remaining. It's mostly on private farms, unfortunately, or even in nature reserves that are not open to the public. It's a pity. Many nature reserves of endangered feld types are not open to public anymore. because one is also afraid of plant poaching. Yeah, so what I'm going to look at and show you is just a couple of pictures of Rhinosterfeld bulbs. We've got the Moraeus, part of the iris family. These are all iris, I think. This is Barbiana blanda. It's an almost extinct Barbiana that occurs in Malmesbury Shale in Rhinosterfeld, not far from Cape Town. It's where everything has become wheat fields. So unfortunately, it is nice to look at, to see, and kind of reassuring to see all the huge wheat fields and productive units, but it's of course to the detriment of biodiversity. Geisoryza are those. Geisoryza is a genus of iris, again, that is very, especially diverse in Rhinosterfeld. Geisoryza radians is the most well known. It's not the best photo of that. I think I chose that because there are two species in one photograph. Then in Rhinosterfeld, this is a Lecanelia, sorry, maybe get to the name later, but a specialized Lecanelia species, Liliflora, I think. No, contaminata, Lecanelia contaminata, that only occurs in Rhinosterfeld in the winelands, and there's not much left of the Rhinosterfeld, so it's also a very rare species these days. These are also from small patches of Rhinosterfeld in the winelands. This is actually north of Cape Town, but yeah, so some of those plants like the Ixia, they're highly endangered and have only habitats an extent of maybe a square kilometer, and that's it. Some species have that naturally, that they are very limited in their range and only occur on such small spaces, but many have also been reduced to those small pockets. There's actually some drama going on here. There is a crab spider that just caught a fly, a hoverfly. The crab spider viciously camouflaged as a flower. But anyway, so it seems to function quite well. What's next? Yeah, there are a couple of Geraniaceae on Rhinosterfeld. I think the most spectacular is the Monsonia speciosa. I don't know whether Pelargonium lobatum can be called a Rhinosterfeld species, but I saw it in Rhinosterfeld, so I included it here. I also saw it on Lion's Head, which makes me think that it might not be that specialized. There are a couple of, Rhinosterfeld used to harbor much larger animals, but like the Blaubock and the Quagga was a zebra that only had stripes on the front legs, but they are all gone. So what remains are some highly endangered endemic species, like probably the geometric tortoise, that beautiful yellow and black tortoise is the most endangered one. Maybe won't survive as species because the habitat is so fragmented and diminished. That's a little Patlurper, and that's an Aurora house snake, one of the many harmless snake species. Otherwise, I wouldn't wrap it around my hands. So then a little bit of Strandveld as well. Strandveld, it belongs to the fynbos, and sometimes it's referred to as coastal fynbos. Not everybody considers this a distinct vegetation type, but I guess it depends on which level you start diversifying. So high components of succulents, annuals, bulbs, graminoids, grass-like, like those restios, and also shrubs. There's also a difference between the Strandveld on the west coast and the south coast. I see more the west coast. We get less fires than in fynbos. It's also being heavily built on here, the Strandveld in the Cape Town area. Oh, sorry, I meant to fill that out more. This is one of the Strandveld pelargoniums, or the Strandveld pelargonium. One comes across this very often, Pelargonium fulgidum, with those bright red, orange-red flowers. So Salvia aurea, it's called now. It used to be Africana lutea, I think. Nemesias, lots of annuals. Nemesias, there are lots of different species which are annuals. And then again, the bulbs are quite fantastic. One of my favorite genera is Ferraria. We've got Ferraria foliosa, and this Ferraria dens punctulata, I think was the name, yes. And Babiana, there are lots of species that are specialized on the grassy soils in the Strandveld. Animals in the Strandveld, reptiles have often, not just reptiles, other animals as well have decided to go underground. So the little rain frogs, lots of lizards, they look like snakes, but they're not, they're lizards, have decided to go underground and escape sun. There's otherwise not so much shade in the Strandveld due to the lack of high growing species. And but also we got, oh yeah, for birders, it's much more exciting, I think, than fynbos itself. You get a lot of waders, a lot of birds that are close to water, and then in the, which includes also birds that non-birders find spectacular, like flamingos and the pelicans. Right, there are actually lots of mammals in the Strandveld. Quite a few, the Dune mole rats, it's a nightmare of every bulb grower, but they need to live as well, and they feed other animals as well. They are very prolific these days that most of its predators have disappeared, but you do still find the caracal, even in urban spaces here around the suburbs of Cape Town. They're seen every now and then. Ierland, very close to Cape Town, you find fairly large herds in Strandveld. It's quite amazing. You wouldn't expect it. Coburg, Coburg is our nuclear power station, right there, outside the large herds of those very large antelopes. And that's just a picture to round it up. That is Strandveld in spring, what it can look like in a good year after decent rains. But lots of daisies. Right, that would be all from me. Hope I didn't draw it out too much.
Thank you so much, Frank. That was absolutely stunning. I totally enjoyed your presentation. So I'm just going to discontinue recording. Just give me a second.
Certainly.